Today's video is going to be all about my hometown of Clitheroe, and to be more precise, the parish church of St Mary Magdalene. It's going to be a little tour of the graveyard filmed last week, where I'm going to try to put a few basic research skills into practice. I'm also going to look at some of the more famous connections to St Mary Magdalene's, one or two infamous ones too. You may not think that chemistry, witchcraft, murder, doctors, Captain James Cook, the Bishop of Rochester and King George III have got anything to do with each other at all. But Clitheroe's parish church has a connection to every single one of those subjects. The original parish church apparently dates back to the Norman period, as many churches were. It was remodelled, most notably in the 1400s and later on in the early 1800s. In the family papers of the Blundels of Ince Blundell near Liverpool and Southport, way over to the southwest of Lancashire where Clitheroe is on the east of the county, you can actually find a reference to a Giles Parker of Hayrockforth, that's probably Horrocksford, who paid £25 on the altar of St Nicholas in the parish church of what was then called Clitheroe on the 12th of November 1548. In 1825, Baines's Directory of Lancashire tells us that unlike today, the town's grammar school still stood within the precincts of the churchyard. Whoever the clergyman was who was the parish vicar was also the headmaster of the grammar school, so the two were definitely linked. In turn, from February 1816, the grammar school was also used as the church's Sunday school, so there's another link there. And about 200 years ago, the interior of St Mary Magdalene's still featured a Norman arch. But when the church was rebuilt in 1828, the Norman arch was apparently saved. Mannex's Directory of 1854 doesn't say anything at all about the arch, and by the time the Victoria County History was published in 1907, there was a suggestion in there that there was a plan to turn this arch into a gateway in the churchyard, but it never actually happened. So by the early 20th century, nobody actually knew what happened to the arch. On the 21st of June 1682, Mr. John Webster was buried at St Mary's Church. Again, according to the Victoria County History, there is a brass plate mounted in the wall inside the church to commemorate the life of this John Webster. But why do you need to know about him in the first place? Born in around about 1611, John Webster was the master of Clitheroe Royal Grammar School. He was also an author. He is known to have written at least 2 books, Metallographia and then Displaying of Supposed Witchcraft in 1677. Metallographia is over 400 pages long, and essentially it's a book about chemistry and various metals and their history and their properties and all the things that you would need to know about metal. It was dedicated to Prince Rupert of the Rhine, cousin of King Charles II, the reigning monarch, and it was printed for a Walter Kettleby at the Bishop's Head in St Paul's Churchyard in London. When I was researching the origins of Jane Sharp's The Midwife's Book, which was also published in 1671, I discovered that Jane Sharp had her book printed somewhere near St Paul's Churchyard too. I am beginning to wonder whether that was actually a popular area for printers to set up their works 350 years ago. But what really fascinates me is the simple question: if John Webster was from Clitheroe, How on earth did he manage to get to London? And how long did it take him? Perhaps he didn't take the book there himself at all. Perhaps he just sent it and trusted that his lengthy manuscript would get there in one piece. Isn't it? The Reverend James King was not a local man. His family actually lived at Kirby Malham in Yorkshire originally. He somehow got himself to St John's College in Cambridge, where he studied his degree, and subsequently became the Vicar of Clitheroe in 1743. He was 28 years old. A year later, he married Anne Walker, who he probably knew reasonably well. She was in fact his cousin. Parish records suggest that they had 8 children baptised at St Mary's Church in Clitheroe. The Reverend King went on to become the Vicar of Guildford in 1772, Canon of Windsor 1774, the Dean of Raphoe, and according to Mannex's History and Directory of Mid Lancashire, he was even the chaplain of the House of Commons at one point. So even if nobody else had done anything notable in the King family at all, Reverend James King would have been interesting in his own right. As a History of the County of Lancaster Volume 6 says, Reverend King also had several distinguished sons. Oh, he certainly did. James, the 4th child and first son, attended Clitheroe Royal Grammar School. He joined the Navy at the age of 12, and in 1776 he was specially chosen to serve as second lieutenant on the Resolution, which sailed out of Plymouth that July. And during that expedition, James King witnessed the death of the captain, a certain James Cook. You may have heard of him. Also on board was a 22-year-old William Bligh, who in later life would go on to be cast adrift during the mutiny on the Bounty, some 13 years later, and after making it to safety, progressed to become the Governor of New South Wales in Australia. What an interesting voyage that must have been. But on the 16th of November 1784, James King died of tuberculosis. He was actually in Nice in France at the time. He was only 34. But before that, he did find time to write up the 3rd volume of A Voyage to the Pacific Ocean, which was a completion of the work that Captain Cook had begun before his death. James's younger brother, Walker King, went on to become the Bishop of Rochester. Then Walker's son, Walker Jr., born in 1798, so nephew Captain King, became the Archdeacon of Rochester, and he also married Anne Heberden, the daughter of King George III, a physician in ordinary. And Walker Jr. and Anne's second son, Edward King, then went on to become the Bishop of Lincoln. So that family were really, really well connected. I think they lived in Clitheroe. There's an unusual name. You don't often get many people called Hagar. Hagar is a biblical name. She was mentioned in the book of Genesis as a slave to Sarah and Abraham, so it is said. But Hagar Dugdale's tombstone tells a story all of its own. Born Hagar Towler, she was living in Barrow Ford when she married William Dugdale, an overlooker, at Colne on Christmas Day 1841. Christmas Day weddings were not all that unusual, because often it was one of the few days a year that people had off work, and you weren't really supposed to get married on a Sunday. Many people did just get married on Christmas Day. They've also got all the Christmas food in, so you might as well make a celebration of it. So Hagar and William had 5 children: Mary, Sarah, Alice, Ellen and baby Joseph in 1850. Hagar died on the 1st of November 1850, and she was buried 2 days later. And what is particularly tragic is that her son Joseph, the baby, died that very same day, and his funeral took place another 2 days later on the 5th of November 1850. So not a good week at all for poor William. The 1851 census says that William, who was originally from Blackwell in the Pendle Hill area, and the children lived on Harry Hayhurst Lane in Clitheroe. William didn't actually see Christmas 1851. He died on the 30th of November that year. And 10 years later, the census shows that his daughters were living with their grandparents. William, of course, as we've seen, was buried with his wife and his baby in Clitheroe, and that's where they still are today. This seems to be the gravestone of Thomas Geldard, I think. But as you can see, there are definitely loads of other relatives. Somebody there, I think, only a few months old. The inscription definitely has not stood the test of time. So this actually links into one of my previous videos. We've got Susie Hayes, wife of Thomas Hayes of Twiston. So they've come all the way from Twiston to be buried, and we've even got all these biblical inscriptions as well. And they're buried with a grandson. This is why gravestones are absolutely amazing, because these are huge. These are about 6 foot by 3, I would guess, so you can fit a lot of relatives on a stone that size. You get a really good sense of who is who. Anna Mary, John Hayes of Worston, Susanna his wife, William their son. Oh, so we actually know how they all fit together, even better. It's time to tell you the story of Dr. Hurd. And despite his misleading name, Doctor had absolutely nothing to do with the medical profession. Doctor and his twin brother, Doctor was his forename, were baptised together at Clitheroe on the 30th of October 1748. They were the 5th and 6th of 10 children born to Richard Hurd, a butcher, and Mary Wilkinson. In August 1775, Doctor married Mary Whittaker at Clitheroe, and their first child, Thomas, was baptised 4 months later, followed by baby Mary in 1780, so there's a 5-year gap between the two children. And it was during this 5-year gap that Doctor got his name into the papers as far away as Kent. On the 17th of April that year, 3 men, Nicholas Wilkinson, Dr. Hurd and Henry Worswick, were tried at Lancaster for the wilful murder of George Battersby. George's life had ended on the 25th of March 1773, and the case was described as extraordinary. An incredible 30 witnesses appeared for the prosecution, and the witnesses told how George was seen in the company of Nicholas Wilkinson, Dr. Hurd and Henry Worswick, and a 4th man who is identified only as Dewhurst, who allegedly was now dead. They dragged George down a lane. One witness actually rescued poor George twice before he was recaptured, and they saw no more of the men that night. But the next day, this unnamed witness walks down the same lane, and there he sees some blood on the floor and a broken hedge. He followed the trail of blood as far as a pond in a field. Where exactly in the town this pond was is not stated, and to his alarm he saw George Battersby, apparently an old man, lying in the water, and naturally the witness went and alerted his brother, who suggested that maybe they should go back and keep watch at the site in case the culprits returned, because there is a lifeless body lying in the water. Logic tells you somebody's going to try and move that body somewhere else. So that night the brothers lay in wait, and they spotted Wilkinson, Hurd and Worswick trying to throw people off their scent by leaving Clitheroe in 3 different directions before they finally made a big circle, I'm guessing, and eventually met at the pond. And as they were in the process of moving the body, the witnesses, who concealed themselves somewhere in the scene, made a noise. Afraid of drawing attention to their presence, they ran off and of course didn't see what happened afterwards. So 3 weeks later, people are getting rather suspicious. They want to know what happened to George Battersby. And Wilkinson, Hurd and Worswick were brought in front of the justices of the peace. But unfortunately, there was not enough evidence to commit them for trial, and so they had to be released. Henry Worswick took the inventive step of joining the army and soon found himself dispatched to Quebec in Canada. He probably thought he was quite safe over there. And before he left, he couldn't help mentioning that he knew who was responsible for the murder of George Battersby, and he incriminated Wilkinson and Hurd. 3 years later, in 1776, part of a human body was found in the town's bone house in so mangled a state that the witnesses couldn't even be sure that it actually was George Battersby. But somebody was connected enough or bright enough to appeal to the Secretary of State. They got in touch with the Secretary of State and immediate action was taken. Henry Worswick was being extradited back from Canada to England. They actually managed to do that in 1776. So despite this, even after they managed to bring Worswick and Nicholas Wilkinson and Dr. Hurd to trial, it was a long trial lasting 16 or 17 hours. The accused ultimately walked free. Dr. Hurd stayed in Clitheroe even after all this, We know he had another child in 1780, not long afterwards. His wife Mary was buried at St Mary's on the 7th of January 1826. She was 77 years old, and Doctor survived her by 11 years. When he was buried on the 10th of February 1837, he was an astonishing 89 years old. And to think that his life could have ended so much earlier in no very different circumstances. Whether he did it or not, I can't say. And I wonder if anybody ever will get to the bottom of it.
This is getting even more peculiar. Why are my videos starting to overlap? We have somebody here called William Preston Holt, who is from Martintop, where there is a chapel, which was in my other video the other week. Just as a reference point here, that is Church Brow with the NFU building. This is a kind of gravestone that I like to see. If you ever happen to be looking for John Earnshaw, who was a surgeon, if you found this, you would know that you had got your man. And here he is. And it looks like he was also the son of Mark, who was also a surgeon. Obviously something of a family trade. On which note, we have got another surgeon here. So actually, poor old Edmund didn't live very long, did he? 42, and his son William dies at 4. Susanna, the widow, lives to be 81. Daughter Sarah, daughter Mary. And also Jane, the youngest and last surviving, she makes it to 84. That is quite amazing, really, to think. So the last surviving daughter dies in 1851, and her dad had died in 1767. That is, she dies 84 years after her father. So does that mean that Jane must have been a baby when her dad died? That's quite sobering.
From what I've been able to establish, Edmund Baldwin never even knew his daughter Jane. Jenny, as she was originally known, was baptised on the 21st of August 1767, about 2 months after her father was buried. Parish records show that Edmund Baldwin and Susanna Standen had got married at Clitheroe on the 20th of January 1762, so they were only married a little over 5 years. Jenny was their fourth child, after Mary in 1763, Sarah in 1764, and William in 1765. And in old age, the burial register called the youngest daughter Jane, a more formal version of the name she'd been given at baptism, and it indicated that by 1851 she was living in Blackburn. Now the gravestone indicates that Jane was still alive on census night, and sure enough, she was living at 20 King Street in Blackburn. Described as a gentle woman, she was 83 years old, single, and she employed 2 servants, which leads me to think that she was living on some kind of income, some inheritance, some annuity. Perhaps as a surgeon, her father did save a bit of money and had the means to provide his children with some kind of annuity like that. The family gravestone also indicates that none of the Baldwin children, neither Jenny nor her two other sisters or her brother, actually had any descendants of their own. So the family line comes to the end with that gravestone, effectively. And how often do you see that happen?
Jamesoyle of Horrocksford Hall, Isabel his wife, Giles the son, and Martha his wife, and their son Robert, grandson, so there's 4 generations there, who was born at Dover in New Hampshire in North America, and yet he manages to get to Clitheroe by the time he's 5 months old. He must have spent half of his life on a boat.
The amazing thing about gravestones and churchyards in general is that if you walk around them, you can often piece together all these interesting stories just by comparing dates and years and places. You can learn a lot about people, on how they lived, on where they travelled, whether they emigrated, and there are countless stories that you could tell using the registers for St Mary Magdalene's Church. Not least for those of the 11 people whose funerals occurred between the 29th of August and the 11th of October 1849, who had the word cholera written next to their names in the burial registers. That's a much bigger topic, and maybe one day I will put a video together on that. So I hope that this video has gone some way to demonstrate that just by taking those names and dates on a gravestone as a bit of a starting point, you can then cross-reference them with all sorts of different resources, newspapers, census records, archive catalogues, whatever you like, to try to investigate the lives of people as they were lived before somebody actually finally did get their name inscribed on that gravestone. We can't talk to those people, but we can still learn an awful lot about how they lived and what they experienced. If you enjoyed this virtual tour of Clitheroe's parish churchyard, or you've got any connections to the town at all, or maybe you can even add to some of the information that I have managed to include in this video, please leave me a comment. I would love to hear it. I am sure that you have got stories and bits of extra information that could add to what is in this video, because really, family and local history is very much about pooling knowledge, I always think. Why not use this video as an opportunity to do exactly that?